so good to be a part of a community that's able to lift one another up. Something I'm so grateful for about this church, whether it's working with kids and families or missionaries. This is a church that believes in building God's kingdom. And so I'm just so grateful to be a part of Lake City Church. My name is Andrew. If we haven't had the pleasure of meeting, I have the opportunity to serve as family life pastor here at Lake City Church, which is all sorts of fun in all sorts of directions with kids and families and just all the fun things that are happening, especially as the sun's coming out. Man, there's so many great things to look forward to in hanging out with kids. And so I'm looking forward to this spring and this summer. But for right now, this is also one of my favorite weeks of the year as we head into Easter. And we've just been in this great series called New, the week that changed everything. And this morning, what we're going to be doing is looking at a story that happened on a Wednesday of that week. And we're going to look at two individuals and their hearts in this story. One that was self-serving and one who had the heart of surrender. And as we kind of unpack this, really the goal is to also then look at our own hearts, right? Even though these may have happened thousands of years ago, it's so applicable and challenging for us today. So let's jump in. You know, it's always interesting the week heading into Easter, and this week specifically, I was just thinking about how we always do an Easter kind of series. And it's one of those things where we always build in and we celebrate on Easter. But one of the things about always doing a series building into Easter is that you know the ending. I mean, I don't want to spoil it, but Jesus comes back to life. And that's what we're celebrating. And so it's one of those things in a series where you know how it's going to end. It's like right now we've been taking our kids through different movies that I loved growing up. And like watching them see like Star Wars for the first time, and they're like, "Oh, Darth Vader's his dad." You know, there's another layer of joy in seeing someone else experience that. And about 12, 13 years ago, my wife and I moved to the peninsula on the west coast of Washington. And speaking of just kind of knowing the end and seeing the end and what that means and the details leading up to it, we're in a town basically west of Tacoma, southwest of Seattle, and it was a smaller town. And so basically what that meant is if you needed something specific, you had to go to the major city, right? So we would get on Highway 16, cross Tacoma Narrows Bridge, get into that major on-ramp onto I-5, which would take us anywhere we needed to go. But as we started doing that trip, something stood out to me. And I'm one of those people who fixates on like something simple or something stupid. And it's something that I'll get like totally focused on, and then I'll bring it up to my wife. Like I'll be focused on it for like months, and I'll be like, did you see it? She has no clue what I'm even talking about. And what happened was every time we'd go towards I-5, Highway 16, this on-ramp, you know, it would be about 20 feet in the air coming over, but there was another bridge partly built next to it. And so I became fixated on it. And I thought, okay, well, maybe in the next season they're going to start working on it again. But 6 months went by, 9 months went by, nothing's happening. I'm like, I have to know. I was just so consumed. I got to know what's going on with this half of a bridge. And so I start digging around online, and I realized that in 2010, they started to build this off-ramp from Highway 16 by I-5. But there was like this really small problem. And this small problem began with just an inch. They began this project an inch off of what they were supposed to. And by the time they were done, that inch was 12 feet. And the major problem was that they completed 90% of the project before they realized their error. Isn't that wild to imagine how off it got just from that small amount right there? In fact, I love this line. It's just so thoughtful. It's insightful. It's inspiring. One of the engineers said this when interviewed. He said, "We didn't end up in the right spot." I mean, just let it, right? Like, you can go back to that over and over again. And what started as just a small problem became a $1 million mistake that they had to fix. Yeah, I actually never found out if he kept his job, but that was quite the problem to have. And the thing is that if you don't know where you're going to end, it's easy to miss out on the important details that get you to that point. And this series is doing the same thing in a week that changed everything. As we look at Jesus entering into Jerusalem and clearing out the temple and teaching in the temple, these moments gain greater meaning and value for where we're going to end up next Sunday. And I want to do something similar this morning. I want to read actually the end of our story this morning with that same intention, with that same thought process, so that we can grab greater detail from the core of the story. If you have your Bibles, you can open to Matthew 26. We're going to begin there in verse 14. It'll be up on the screen as well. It says this: one of the 12 disciples went to the chief priests. His name was Judas Iscariot. He asked, "What will you give me if I hand Jesus over to you?" So they counted out 30 silver coins for him. From then on, Judas watched for the right time to hand Jesus over to them. This is a major moment in the story of Judas where he is committed to betraying Jesus. But so often, these major decisions that happen in people's lives, they're usually not completely removed from where their heart was already at. You see, Judas had a heart that was self-serving. And so there were moments that built up to this specific moment. And that's what I want to really dig into this morning. What we're going to do is we're actually going to read the narrative from Matthew and from John. And the reason, as we read through both of these in just a minute, is to grab greater detail from what's taking place. I think that's what's so fascinating about the Gospels, is that two individuals experience the same thing, but can write different details into that moment and the importance of the things that stood out to them. So let's back up a little bit in Matthew 26, and then we're also going to jump over to John 12 in just a second. It says this, starting in verse 6 of chapter 26. Jesus was in Bethany. He was in the home of Simon, who had a skin disease. A woman came to Jesus with a special sealed jar of very expensive perfume. She poured the perfume on his head while he was at the table. When the disciples saw this, they became angry. "Why this waste?" they asked. "The perfume could have been sold at a high price. The money could have been given to poor people." Jesus was aware of this, so he said to them, "Why are you bothering this woman? She has done a beautiful thing to me. You will always have poor people with you, but you will not always have me. She poured the perfume on my body to prepare me to be buried. What I'm about to tell you is true. What she has done will be told anywhere this good news is preached all over the world. It will be told in memory of her." Now turn over to John 12. Let's jump right into it and hear the story again from this different perspective. It says that Jesus came to Bethany, where Lazarus lived. Lazarus was the one Jesus had raised from the dead. A dinner was given at Bethany to honor Jesus. Martha served the food. Lazarus was among the people at the table with Jesus. Then Mary took about a pint of pure nard. It was an expensive perfume. She poured it on Jesus' feet and wiped them with her hair. The house was filled with the sweet smell of the perfume. But Judas Iscariot didn't like what Mary had done. He was one of Jesus' disciples. Later, he was going to hand Jesus over to his enemies. Judas said, "Why wasn't this perfume sold? Why wasn't the money given to poor people? It was worth a year's pay." He didn't say this because he cared about the poor. He said it because he was a thief. Judas was in charge of the money bag. He used to help himself to what was in it. "Leave her alone," Jesus said. "The perfume was meant for the day I am buried. You will always have the poor among you, but you won't always have me." During this event, we're on Wednesday of the week that changed everything. We're 2 days away from Jesus going to the cross. And we're at a unique point where there are some very important decisions that were made by some people around Jesus. And so let's look at this story and see what's really taking place. As Jesus went back out to Bethany, there was a meal prepared in honor of Jesus. Those closest to him were invited, and so we know that this is in Lazarus' home. Martha and Mary are his sisters. The disciples were there as well, maybe others. And this is a meal to honor Jesus. This is his closest friends. In the Greek, it says that Jesus relaxed at the table, which is just, it's fascinating in a way. I mean, if you knew you were going to die in 2 days, would you be able to relax? Would you be at ease just being with other people? And yet Jesus finds himself in this moment at this very important meal where he's at ease and he's relaxing at the table with Lazarus, even though he's aware of what's about to take place. And so the meal is prepared and it's served. But after the meal, something happens. I'm sure they were probably chatting, as any of us would do after a good meal. And Mary walks back into the room with something in her hand, and it's a jar. It's sealed. And I think about how interesting that would have been, because as Mary walked into the room, I don't think the disciples would have had any clue what she was carrying, but Lazarus and Martha for sure. Her siblings would have known exactly what she was bringing into the room. And I just know there's this interesting moment, because everybody in that room at one point in time when they first met Jesus thought he was just a teacher, thought he may have been a prophet, but now for sure they know he's Lord. There's been a story happening as they follow Jesus with what has taken place. And so she walks in with this jar and she breaks the seal. And what's inside but an expensive perfume, pure nard. Now the importance here is significant, because nard was something that was imported from India, and it was a rare, expensive perfume. But what would likely happen in the process is they would take the leaf of the plant, which is what was mainly used to make the perfume side, and they would actually mix it and grind it up with the root. So it would no longer be pure, but they could profit more from it. So in the Greek, when it says it's pure nard, that's actually really important, because what it's saying is that the root was not mixed in with the leaf, but rather the leaf was purely made into this perfume, which added to the expense and the unique and rarity of this item. Judas points out in John's story that it was worth a year's pay, roughly 300 denarii. And 1 denarii was an average pay of an individual working for a day's wage. So by today's standard, if you made $15 an hour, you worked 8 hours that day, that's $120. Multiply it by 300, that is $36,000. That's what Mary had in her hand. That's the expense of the item that she was holding. And this perfume gave off just a sweet scent. It filled the room. Can you think about certain smells that just like are overwhelming? They fill the room. You know, I think about like working on dinner. When you turn on the grill, right, it's getting nice out, and that like you got bacon on there, you got some burgers on there, and there's just a smell that permeates and fills the room. I think about other times, people like my grandfather who wore a certain kind of cologne, Stetson for men. That smell is like in my brain. That's a smell of a grandpa, you know? That's what I grew up with. Or more recently, this is relevant here at the church, we've been having an issue in the other building, and we have a room dedicated to 2-year-olds, and next to it for 3-year-olds, and in between is a small restroom with a changing table. Now, on Tuesdays, this room is often used for babies as well as a nursery, and as you know, with babies, there is a smell that happens with babies, and we have a mom's event on Tuesday mornings. We were having Fully Devoted on Tuesday nights. And so there was about like a 4-hour period where there were babies in this room on Tuesday nights. And so they had the fan in that bathroom going 24 hours. Like, we have got to get rid of it, because this smell was overwhelming, right? But it just wasn't being fixed. And so this week, we had someone come out and check it out. We're like, we need a different fan. We need help with what's going on. And that building was built 25 years ago, by the way. And the individual that was checking it came down and he said, yeah, so there's a problem. The fan in the vent is working great, but there's actually no ventilation. We're like, what? No, it's actually, the fan's just pushing it in above the ceiling tile, and then it's spreading for the whole room. And let me tell you guys, just a scent that is overwhelming. And don't worry, it's getting fixed. I just applied for the Vision Initiative. We're moving forward with it. We're going to give to see this problem solved and move past this. But when you talk about a scent that can fill the room, the opposite of that scent was this scent. Mary had this perfume, this expensive, rare perfume. And what's interesting is that as she approached Jesus, I could just imagine Lazarus and Martha know what's about to take place. They can see what's happening. The disciples confused probably at first about what's going to happen. But as she approaches Jesus, she breaks the seal, and she begins to pour the perfume over Jesus' head. Now, if you caught it in the passage, Matthew says that the perfume was poured over his head, but John references specifically the feet. And this is what's unique about two individuals relaying this story, is that something stood out specifically to both of them. Matthew is talking about Jesus being wholly anointed for barrier, whereas John's going to reference something else specifically in just a second. But what begins to happen is something that begins to set the disciples at ease. In fact, in Matthew it says they were angry. But that's not even where Mary stopped. She didn't stop with just pouring the perfume over Jesus. What she did next was even more, it was even further than what the disciples thought would ever happen. And here's what I mean by this, is that Mary began to let down her hair. Now, I know in our culture, this doesn't really seem like a big deal. It doesn't really hit the same way. But in their culture, we have to recognize that women would not let down their hair in public. They would only do it in the privacy of their home and with their husband. And so to do this in a public place, even though with close friends, it was something that would have been seen as just completely undignified, completely reckless. Like, why would you do that in a public place? This actually would have been the most vulnerable thing that Mary could possibly have done in that moment. And that's why John brings so much attention to it, not only in chapter 12, but actually in chapter 11, when he talks about Jesus coming to raise Lazarus from the dead, and he references to Mary, he says she is the one who let down her hair and washed Jesus' feet, dried his feet with her hair. And in just reading that, it wouldn't seem like a big deal, but in that moment, it was massive. Because what Mary has stepped into that moment with is the most financially expensive thing she could have owned. Most commentators believe that that would have been a family heirloom. This would have represented generational wealth that she has now poured out onto Jesus. And in that same moment, she kneels at Jesus' feet and she lets down her hair. She has now put herself into a place of being completely undignified, humbling herself at the feet of Jesus. Her heart was in a posture of surrender. And in that moment where I think she fully understood and realized who Jesus was, and maybe even what was about to take place that week, she saw something the disciples didn't. And that still confuses me when I think about what happened, because the disciples were so close with Jesus. They had been with him for years. They had heard all of his teaching, all of his wise sayings. They had seen miracle after miracle, the feeding the 5,000, the walking on water. They were in a room at a table with a dude that was dead, like just before this story. Lazarus was dead. They can visually see that guy was dead. He's alive, relaxing at the table with Jesus. So they've witnessed the most incredible things. And yet, what were they focused on? As Mary sat in that moment and poured the perfume over Jesus, knelt down and let down her hair, they were focused not on the awe and the beauty of the moment, but on the practical nature of what was taking place. Take a look at what it says in verse 8. This is what their response was, why this waste? And that's a good question. If I'm being honest, if you had something valued at $36,000 and you just emptied it out, here's my offering. If I was with the disciples, I would have been like, what are we doing? Scoop it back up. We can save it still, I promise. Can you imagine Lazarus and Martha maybe? What were they thinking as she brings this out? Maybe they think she's just going to take a dab and maybe put some on his head to anoint him. And she's like, all of it. $36,000 is actually wild. And it's not practical. And here's what's difficult for me, and maybe it's difficult for you too, is that sometimes following Jesus isn't practical. A self-serving heart, everything's practical. And yet when I enter into a relationship with Jesus who calls me to surrender, not everything's practical. Because when Jesus begins to confront my heart and he says, you need to forgive those who have sinned against you, that's not practical. When you need to reconcile relationships that you're not at fault for, that's not practical. When I need to give sacrificially of my finances, uncommon generosity is not practical. It's definitely not self-serving. When Jesus calls me to step out of my comfort zone and talk to people I don't know, which I don't love doing. Jackie called me out on that a few weeks ago. Man, you know when your spouse is right about something and you don't want to tell them? I know it's a different message, but it's definitely not practical. And stepping into a relationship with Jesus where he calls us to surrender, we have to recognize it's not always practical. And Judas couldn't reconcile this. This is that moment that Judas is witnessing from the side and he's like, I'm out. I can't deal with this anymore. Because his goal was self-service. And if your goal is self-service, the ways of Jesus are always going to conflict. And so how does Jesus respond in this moment? There's an unease what's happening. I'm sure he's frustrated, but not frustrated, I think angry. I think he's frustrated sad. Because the disciples can't see the beauty of what's taking place in this moment. They're wholly focused on the impractical nature of what's happening. And so he says, why are you bothering Mary? What she's done is beautiful. Can't you see she has anointed me for burial? But the disciples are focused on what's practical, and so they couldn't get past it. They missed it. And Judas, above all, missed it completely. And this was his breaking moment. This was that moment where he fully decided that he was going to betray Jesus. There's a statement in that part we read at the beginning of the message that resonates more than anything else, and it's in verse 15. At the beginning of that sentence, he says, when Judas goes to the religious leaders, "What will you give me?" He says, "What will you give me if I turn over Jesus? What will you give me?" And here's the thing. I don't think Judas's heart was any different with Jesus. I think that when he followed Jesus, it was the same sentiment. I think when he was following Jesus, he was saying, "What will you give me?" And he found gain from Jesus for a certain period of time. And I think so many of us can find ourselves in that same situation. Maybe that's a part of your story or someone you know, that they are a part of the church. They say they follow Jesus, but that question is still guiding their heart because it's self-serving. And so they may go to church, but they're saying, "What will you give me?" For Judas, it was financially. He was finding things. He was taking money. But when you say, "What will you give me?" maybe there's relational things you're finding. Maybe there's status or influence that you find. And you're a part of the church or you're following Jesus for a season, but truly your heart is still one of self-serving. And at some point you're going to find yourself in a moment like Judas did, saying it doesn't benefit me any longer. Judas went to the religious leaders, but we often go to the world. We say, "What will you give me?" Comfort, control, power, finances. And what's hard is that even though Judas is this person that we can kind of place up as like the bad guy, we see his heart as self-serving, and if we asked an honest question, we'd recognize how often our heart is naturally self-serving as well. And that's the challenging part of this story, is when you can recognize the similarities that you maybe have with Judas. That's why it's so important when Jesus calls us to surrender. Surrender is a strange thing because I don't know about you, but when I first think of surrender, I think almost of like in wartime. And when you surrender, you're basically giving up. Or maybe if there's something you own that you've surrendered, it almost means like you don't get to use something anymore. You've surrendered it over. Or it almost means the lack of action. But that's not what's being talked about here. When we talk about surrendering to Jesus, it's not actually the lack of action, it's actually the increase of work. It's not the giving up of something, but it's the working towards something. And so when we talk about surrender, it's not giving up in the sense you're not doing anything, it's giving up a self-serving heart. Because when we stop working towards surrender, our heart will default to self-service. That's the default of our sinful nature, is that we are going to do things that are practical and serving ourselves. It takes work to step into surrender. It takes work to put others above yourself. It takes work to have uncommon generosity and to serve those around you and to build God's kingdom. Those take work, and that's why they're not always practical. And I think when we become apathetic and lazy, and when we drift from where Jesus wants us, that's when we see a self-serving heart rise to the surface. We have to continue to work to surrender our hearts. And as we surrender our lives, we celebrate new life in Christ because he lives in us. The old is gone and it's dead, and there is a new life that now lives in us. When I think about surrender, one of my favorite and most impactful stories for me is the story of my grandfather. My grandfather passed away about 20 years ago from cancer, and in that last season of his life, as many of you are aware, there's lots of doctor visits, lots of conversations, there's lots of treatments, and there's one story where my grandfather had to go to the hospital, and the nurse was kind of going through the checklist of things and all those questions. Where this one moment just really stood out. And so she starts in on the questions, and she gets to a normal one where she asks my grandfather, "Do you smoke?" And my grandfather said no. And she said, "Have you ever smoked?" And he said yes. And she said, "When was the last time you smoked?" And he said, 1953. And she goes, "Okay." So she moves on, and she goes, "Do you drink?" And my grandfather says no. She says, "Have you ever drank?" He says yes. And she goes, "When's the last time?" He said, 1953. And as she had her checklist in front of her, she looked up and she goes, "What happened in 1953? And my grandpa's words were, "I met a man. I met a man." So, my grandfather was in World War II, in the European tour, and I don't know if he went into the war with all these issues, but there are so many stories about him and his anger and his addiction. In fact, at one point, there's a story where he knocked a lieutenant unconscious because he didn't like him. So he faced demotion after demotion and all these different things. And so by the time the war was over and he came out, this anger was rooted deep in his life, and he was a chain-smoking alcoholic. His marriage was a mess, and it was falling apart, and by the time it had completely fallen apart and he had walked away from it, he had hit rock bottom in his life. But then he met my grandmother, and they tried to start again, but those same things were still there, that anger and that addiction. After being married for a little bit, my grandmother actually started going to church. She found Jesus. And she was a clever person, and so she started getting rid of the extra reading material in the bathroom. Sorry for the extra bathroom jokes, but she got rid of the extra reading material and just put a Bible in there. It was the only thing my grandpa had access to. And in 1953, there was an evangelist coming to town, Anchorage, Alaska, and my grandmother convinced my grandpa to go. And it was that night that my grandpa surrendered to Jesus. Obviously, my grandfather wasn't perfect, and there were so many things he had to work on, but that night he had to surrender some things, and some of those addictions he left at that altar that he never picked back up or took with him. And that heart of surrender changed his life, it changed his marriage, it changed his family, and obviously it's changed my life. And so I am the byproduct of someone else's surrender, now passed on for generations. And I don't know where you're at in your story this morning. If you've yet to find that place at the altar, if you've yet to find that moment where you've come before Jesus and just said, "You know what? I've tried this self-serving thing and it hasn't worked out. I need to surrender to you." I want you to know that we have something for you. This gift is free and it's for you, and you can grab it on your way out. There is a Bible, there is a reading plan, and there's an opportunity to experience a different way of living that will transform your life. It will bring about a new perspective. When we talk about a week that changed everything, Jesus wants to change everything in your life. And if you grab one of these boxes and you need to meet, we not only have a new believers class happening in a couple of weeks, but I would love to meet with you and talk with you. Because it's so important to recognize that we have been called to surrender to Jesus. But here's the thing, most of us in this room, we made that decision and we're on this journey. But we're also recognizing that this journey's not over. That there are things that are still on our heart, there are things that are still wearing us down in new seasons, and we have to continue to find ourselves at the feet of Jesus. We have to continue to work to put our hearts into the position of surrender. Otherwise, we're going to default to self-serving again. I don't know if you've experienced that, but I've experienced that. The apathy of the heart that moves me away from Jesus. And I have to keep coming back and say, "No, I surrender to you." And so that's where we're closing out this morning. As we're going into this week that changed everything and recognizing the celebration that's going to happen next week, I think it's also important to know that you and I have been called to come back to the feet of Jesus and surrender. So what is it? What is it for you right now? Maybe it's your calendar. It's overwhelming. There's so many things laying out. It's like a puzzle every week that you're trying to complete, and you can't get it all to work just right. And really, if you were to be honest, it's actually about control. And you're wanting to control things, but you can't control everything. And you're doing the best you can, but you need to surrender it. Maybe there's some addictions in your life. They've been there for a long time. And you felt like you've tried before, but you've just never been able to get past it. And you've tried to surrender it to Jesus. I would encourage you, again, come to the feet of the cross and say, Jesus, I'm giving this to you. Maybe there's finances you've been worshiping. There's the idea of power or influence. There are these things that are overwhelming your heart that you keep replacing. You keep moving Jesus out and replacing with these things, and you have to come back and say, I'm going to surrender them again. I need to surrender these to Jesus.